Welcome to another FIA Center on U.S. Politics and Power Transatlantic Currents webcast or seminar. Today we're going to be talking about U.S. assistance to Ukraine, the backstory and the complexity that is involved in not just deciding what to give, but when, how, and how it should be packaged together with allies to ensure that Ukraine can get the most benefit from it, and as a side note, maybe cause the most destructive another effect on Russian forces and Russian capabilities. As usual, I'm here as an introductory host. I'm the lead researcher for the Center on Politics and Power. But no one came here to listen to me for very long, so I'm just going to briefly introduce Leo Michel, who's a non-resident fellow for FIA, but he's also a non-resident fellow of the Atlantic Council, and I think very appropriately for what Finland has been going through in the last year. And for this topic, Leo has worked at the Institute for National Strategic Studies and Director for NATO Policy, and separately Director for Non-Nuclear Arms Control in the Office of Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, as we know. With this introduction, I guess I have to say, or the first thing that I want to say is, Leo, thanks to you and innumerable other people on both sides of the Atlantic for having gotten Finland and US to the place we now are, which is as allies. In terms of housekeeping for our listeners, please write in your questions in the chat. We'll be sharing some links during discussions there, but I will be collecting after the initial discussion is done. I'll be collecting questions from there and running the discussion question and answer. And as usual, we aim to finish within the hour. With these words, Leo, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Hello from Washington. We are entering the 15th month now since Russia launched its full-scale attack on Ukraine. There was something of a Russian offensive during the winter with very heavy losses on the Russian side, perhaps some minor tactical advances, but at great cost. But we've seen just overnight in Kyiv and in other cities evidence of continuing Russian cruise missile and drone attacks, which hit mainly civilian targets, sometimes exclusively civilian targets. President Zelensky, in recent interview with the Nordic press, including Finnish media, has confirmed that Ukraine is planning a major counteroffensive. And the feeling on this side of the Atlantic is that this could happen relatively soon, in the coming weeks or perhaps a month or two. During a congressional hearing on Wednesday, the commander of the U.S. European Command, who is Army General Chris Cavoli, said the following. He said, quote, "I am very confident that we have delivered the material that they, meaning the Ukrainians, need, and will continue a pipeline to sustain their operations as well," unquote. So recalling the observation that's been attributed to another Army general, Omar Bradley, who was one of the top American commanders in Europe during World War II, he said, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." So it seems like an opportune time to take a closer look at US military assistance to Ukraine. And to do this, I want to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Walsland to the webinar. He is the founder and chief executive officer of Diamond 6 Leadership and Strategy, which conducts executive leadership development workshops for many public institutions, for US government departments and agencies, and nonprofit organizations and corporations. He's also a visiting professor of international security at Dickinson College and a national security affairs consultant and commentator for CBS television and radio networks. Jeff is a retired U.S. Army colonel We met actually in the early 90s at the Pentagon. Has a very distinguished 34-year military career, has had a variety of command and staff positions, and he commanded a field artillery battalion in Europe, and he participated during 1990, 1991 in operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in the Middle East. He's also served on the staff of the National Security Council. So welcome, Jeff. In the chat function, we're going to put up a link where you can see, as we get into this discussion, the latest Department of Defense act, which lists in great detail the security assistance that's been committed to Ukraine. The sum total of this, the financial total, is really quite staggering. Since February 2022, the U.S. has announced over 30 assistance packages, totaling over $35 billion for Ukraine. So, Jeff, artillery has played an important role in the war in Ukraine. And as I mentioned, you've commanded artillery formations in Europe during the Cold War, and then in the Middle East during a hot war. So I want to begin the discussion about talking about artillery. So far, the U.S. has provided from its own inventories, or in some cases has committed to provide from future orders, over 230 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter howitzers, over 2 million artillery rounds for those weapons, 38 high mobility artillery rocket systems known as HIMARS, and an undisclosed number of their highly precise ammunitions. So I'd like to ask you, what factors has Washington had to consider regarding the selection of these artillery systems, their means of delivery to Ukraine, and everything that goes with it, the training of Ukrainian personnel to maintain, employ, and integrate them, and what's been the role of intelligence in helping the Ukrainians for targeting purposes? Over to you.
First of all, Leo, I want to say it's a great honor and pleasure to be on this particular call for the Finnish Institute. And might also add, as a person who spent the vast majority of his military career, as Leo pointed out, in NATO, either physically serving in NATO or working on NATO issues in the Pentagon or the White House, how delighted I personally am at the entry of Finland into NATO. So for me personally, to everyone out there who is Finnish, welcome to NATO. I am so delighted that the Finnish people has decided to do this. And I think Finland provides not only material and military assistance to the alliance, but makes the alliance a better organization just based on the values, the democracy that Finland certainly is. And secondly, if there should be any Swedish listeners on this call, I am very, very hopeful that in the coming months, this situation will be resolved and we'll all be celebrating by July, at least, the entry of Sweden as well into NATO. Much, by the way, I would add, to Mr. Putin's chagrin, I would point out, as he had assumed NATO would not pull together in this alliance, and NATO has actually gotten stronger in this particular conflict. But to answer Leo's question, initially when the war began, the emphasis was on providing Ukrainians more of what they already had. And what they had were what we would describe as legacy systems, that being 152 millimeter artillery and 122 millimeter artillery, which were legacy systems from the Soviet Union, from the end of the Cold War, from the Russian system as well. So our efforts really were to try to gather up as much additional ammo and platforms as we could. And many of our NATO partners, particularly in Eastern Europe, Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, the Baltic republics, still had some of those particular weapons in their arsenal. And that put a burden, by the way, in long term on the United States, because as those were transferred to Ukraine, I think the expectation in future is they will be filled in future by items provided by the United States, probably in 155 being the classic weapon system. 155 being what's commonly referred to as a NATO standard. The commonality in NATO, even during the Cold War and subsequently, has been really to make sure we could do three things together fairly well, that our communications devices, though different, could communicate with each other, that our weapons platforms fired the same size rounds, particularly small arms, artillery, and tanks, And thirdly, that we use common fuel. And this is for logistical reasons. Back to Omar Bradley, and strategy is for amateurs and logistics is for sustainment. But I might also point out, in addition to all that military hardware, to include 155 towed and self-propelled artillery that Leo talked about from the United States, a substantial amount of 155s have also been provided by other NATO partners and by countries outside of NATO. Even Australia has provided some 155 millimeter artillery to the Ukraine, and there's an expectation in the near term, quite frankly, that we'll see 155 ammo being provided to Ukraine by the Republic of Korea. And there's an expectation, frankly, in continuing to support some of the existing older systems, that we'll see 152 millimeter ammunition and tank ammunition coming from Egypt going to Ukraine. Self-propelled artillery, towed artillery has been the mix, as Leo pointed out, from towed to 155s to self-propelled. The difference is really the following. That is, a self-propelled gun has greater mobility on difficult terrain, has a bit of armor protection for the crew during combat. That's what I commanded in combat during the Gulf War. Towed weapon system, obviously less mobility, can get stuck in the mud, and there's a lot of mud, particularly in eastern Ukraine, but it can be towed by about anything you can think of, from a truck to a tractor, and they're pretty robust, pretty hard to break a towed weapon system, whereas the howitzer, the self-propelled howitzer, is a function of mechanical issues, turret issues, and so it requires an awful lot of maintenance. And during the Gulf War, where I commanded, again, for logistical reasons, because the mix of artillery in NATO during the Cold War was M203 8-inch howitzers as well as 155, but the decision was made to move only 155 and MLRS rocket systems to support the ground campaign in the Gulf. And that was for logistical reasons. And all you have to do is get out a map and figure out how far it is to move ammunition and howitzers from Germany all the way to Saudi Arabia, and you get an idea of why that was actually done. As far as training on the weapon system, I would argue that a Ukrainian gun crew that can operate a 152 howitzer can operate a 155 millimeter howitzer pretty doggone easily in terms of servicing the piece, what we call actually firing, loading, firing, elevating, traversing the weapon system to point it in the right direction. The real issue is automotive and turret related issues and fuel. As a consequence, you've got to make sure you have a logistical system that moves fuel, particularly in the offensive, very rapidly. Many people don't realize it, but frankly, in the Gulf War, where I commanded, when we got to Kuwait and I got all the way to the highway between Basra and Kuwait City at the very end of the war, we stopped there because we were out of gas. We had moved so quickly that we had moved beyond our fuel supply. And secondly, of course, the whole automotive issue in terms of spare parts, repairs for battle damage, repairs just to normal wear and tear are obviously a lot more important when you're dealing with a self-propelled system as opposed to a towed system. And even with those systems we got, of course, we've got a variety of 155s, not only the ones provided by the United States, but French, Canadians, and others. And each one of those have unique requirements for spare parts and the like. So the whole supply chain issue gets to be part and parcel of the problem as you provide the Ukrainians more and more sophisticated weapon system, artillery being only one example. We could talk about air defense, we could talk about tanks, we probably will here in a few minutes. The targeting of the weapon system and artillery is what's key in many ways to effectiveness. And it really comes down to the following problem. The artillery problem is the ability to acquire a target, prioritize that target, because you get a whole bunch of targets, so the decision has to be made by a prioritization system of which one are we going to engage first, in what order. Process that target in terms of calculating firing data and passing that to a platform, be it an MLRS, be it a HIMARS, be it a 155, be it a 105, whatever weapon system you're going to engage, and then engaging the target and doing all that in what I would call real time or dwell time. Doing that in the fact that the targets you're shooting at are primarily, at least can be mobile, and so you need to hit them before they in fact move. And that's where one of the, I think, hidden stories of the war in Ukraine, along with logistics, has been Starlink, which allowed communication systems for the Ukrainians all across the battlefield, and targeting intelligence, which I think has largely been provided in many ways by the United States. So how you coordinate this large effort, And this is where the contact group, and there's a real story to be told about the contact group, not only in coming together to provide all the materiel from various countries, I think it's over 50 now, but to coordinate that activity so we don't step on each other's toes. So we're providing ammo, you're providing this, and all those things kind of fit together, and we all do what we can do, but it has to be a coordinated effort, because ultimately at the end of the day, you have to think about this in terms of providing the Ukrainians capabilities and not just weapons. Capabilities and not just weapons. How you integrate that now into a combined arms effort. So the artillery has been very important because of the nature of this particular fight, but how you integrate that with the intelligence gathering sources, the radar systems, the logistics, as well as ground maneuver, both mechanized infantry, light infantry, as well as armor, in terms of orchestrating that effort. So one of the things I think quietly has occurred, and we've now trained about 11,000 Ukrainians, is not only training them individually on how to operate a particular weapon, let's say the 155, but how that particular effort is integrated into what we call combined arms operations. And that's why we've been seeing them doing an awful lot of training in places like Grafenwehr in Germany, which is one of the big US training facilities. Now, the proof is going to be in the testing, and obviously we're going to see that played out here, I think, in the very near future by the much expected Ukrainian counteroffensive. And are they able to coordinate that combined arms effort into an overall offensive capability? Last but not least is the actual movement of all this has been another large logistic stories. Think about the problem. We're identifying weapon systems and supplies from all around the globe, not just NATO, because we're providing ammunition sometimes from around the world who have, in some cases, those legacy 152, 122, T-72 tanks and can provide ammo. So we're identifying where they're at. We're moving that to theater, which normally be the European landmass. Normally it's going to have to be moved by maritime operations because of the weight of these particular items. And then you got to orchestrate the actual delivery from the theater from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, on into the Ukraine. So the identification of stocks, movement of stocks, and delivery of stocks is another large part of this overall story of strategy and tactics being for amateurs and logistics being for sustainment.
Thanks, Jeff. There's one specific thing of interest, I think, on artillery that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll move on to some of the other systems. At this congressional hearing that I mentioned with General Cavoli on Wednesday, and he was accompanied there by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe, for International Security Affairs, actually, and that includes Europe in her case, Celeste Wallander. And he was asked by a couple of congressmen, happened to be Republican congressmen. He was pressed on this question of whether to provide cluster munitions that would be used with that American-provided artillery. And he mentioned that cluster munitions can be very effective in certain scenarios, particularly against mixed targets of personnel and equipment. But he was notably non-committal on what his recommendation would be. And to my knowledge, the administration has not made a decision on whether or not to supply such cluster munitions. Apparently, the Russians are using them, or their counterpart. Could you say a little bit about the role of those munitions and why this might be a politically as well as logistically charged issue?
Yeah, because we fired an awful lot of cluster munitions during the Gulf War. It's referred to in artillery parlance as DPICM, dual purpose improved conventional munitions. For us, it could be fired from an 8-inch howitzer, or in case of the Gulf War, 155. Air Force had bombs during the Gulf War to also deliver cluster munitions. And you can think of it as bomblets. Think of an artillery shell, and inside the shell are bomblets that are, say, the size of a baseball. Okay, and so when the round comes over target, it explodes, releasing those bomblets. The bomblets drop to the ground and are designed to pop up and then explode roughly at waist height. So they're devastating, particularly to dismounted infantry, and infantry, you know, in fortifications and the like, in many cases trenches and whatever. Like we know, the Russians are deployed in many cases there in the Donbass region. We used them, like I said, with devastating effect. I remember reading intelligence reports from interviews of Iraqi prisoners at the end of that conflict. They referred to it as iron rain, iron rain. One of the big challenges, though, of the DPICM is, particularly and probably more so in terrain like the desert in the Gulf, you had about a 20% dead rate of these bomblets. So as a consequence, if you were then moving on the offense and you fired this stuff and then you're going to move through the area where you'd fire DPICM, you had a high probability of some of these things still being there. And basically what you've created is kind of like a minefield. And I had one soldier who was injured when one of those things went off under his Humvee, and I had another vehicle injured when one went off under a truck. Luckily, we had no casualties on that one. When I was working on the National Security Council staff, of course, was all back in the days of the pushing for the treaty to prohibit landmines. Well, the United States is still not a signature to that particular treaty, but most of our NATO partners are. And so as a consequence, there was a big push for the United States to eliminate the DPICM because of this potential mining or inadvertent mining effect that firing that weapon occurred. As a consequence, to the best of my understanding, about 10 years ago or more, the United States ceased production of DPICM, but we still have a large amount of that ammunition still in stock. The life expectancy of any artillery round, by the way, is about 20 years. That's why a lot of the stocks we had in the Cold War, and we had lots in Europe, and people wonder why we don't draw from them. Well, they were either moved out at the end of the Cold War, destroyed, or were moved out due to obsolescence. That's really the policy issue that surrounds for the Biden administration, and that's bringing back this whole question of landmines. And we had to move, I remember when I was on the NSC staff as well, coordinate the movement of residual stocks of artillery ammo that we still had, because it was right at the end of the Cold War, in many locations in Europe from NATO partner countries, because they signed off on the landmine treaty, but they still have these particular artillery shells stored on their territory as part of U.S. and overall NATO contingencies.
Thanks very much for the clarification. There was also discussion of, not in detail, but I think you probably have some detail on this, on the difference between the burn rate, that is the rate at which the Ukrainians are using these munitions, compared with the U.S. production rate has been. And I know there are efforts underway to improve or to accelerate the production of some of those munitions. Could you explain just very briefly what are the numbers that we're looking at here?
Yeah, for all contingencies, what you try to capture is what is going to be your burn rate of essential munitions on a daily rate. So during the Cold War, we would calculate what was going to be the burn rate of tank ammo and artillery ammo, and we tried to figure out then how many days of combat we had based on ammunition stocks and pre-position that ammunition fairly far forward so it can be moved quickly into the battle should that in fact occur. Those are all laden with enormous assumptions. As the Cold War ended, those stocks were drawn down, and frankly, our industrial capacity to produce drew down. During the Cold War, as I recollect, the United States had about 14 factories that produced artillery ammunition and small arms. We now have 4. In Europe, the reduction in overall industrial capacity has been even more dramatic in terms of European ability to produce 155, Leo 2 rounds, or Leo 3 rounds rather, small arms, etc. And a couple countries actually purchase small arms from Pakistan and other countries around the world. Don't even have any indigenous production anymore. But using the 155 just as an example, the United States production rate at the start of the war in Ukraine was 175,000 rounds of 155 ammo on an annual basis. Now that's everything. That's smoke. That's illumination. That's training rounds as well as high explosive, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Ukrainians' burn rate has been between 5,000 and 6,000 rounds of artillery every day. So it doesn't take a math major to figure out if they're burning through 5,000 to 6,000 rounds a day, they're burning through our annual production rate in about a month to 4 weeks. As a comparison, at one point in time, the Russians were burning through 40,000 artillery rounds every single day. And we know as well the Russians are having their own problems in trying to replenish ammunition stocks and are looking to purchase ammo from as far away as North Korea to, in fact, make up those shortages. Now, since this war began, there's now been a rush to realize that we do not have the capacity that we need, and we've kind of, if you will, found rediscovered industrial warfare. I always point out to people that in 1916, the Asquith government in Great Britain collapsed, and the issue it collapsed over in the middle of World War I was its inability to produce artillery shells at the rate needed on the Western Front, because the assumptions on requirements have been told to be totally false. So there has been a significant amount of money put in the budget last year to expand production. This doesn't occur overnight. The goal will be to increase U.S. production rate from 175,000 rounds a year for 155, using that example again, to over 1 million rounds a year. But it's going to take at least a year, probably more like 2 years, to create the plants, create the material to produce that, train the workers, et cetera, to do that. Problem is as bad, if not worse, proportionally in Europe, which has a very, very small industrial capacity and very, very difficult ability to expand rapidly. European Union, is my understanding, have pulled together over 1 billion euros just to try to invest in procurement of more ammunition and expanded capacity to produce ammunition. But one more word on that, Leo. This is part and parcel of sophisticated weaponry, and 155 is pretty standard. It's even more difficult when you talk about things like javelins or stingers, which use an awful lot of microprocessors and semiconductors. And some of those particular factory lines have been closed down totally. We don't make any more stingers. We closed that production line down years ago. So whatever's being drawn off and passed to Ukraine in terms of stingers, shoulder fire air defense, are just coming out of existing stocks the United States have, which at the moment, no additional stingers being produced.
So just, and I do want to leave adequate time for audience questions. 3 more questions from me. One very quick. I'd like you to just say a few words about the Abrams tank. I mean, the U.S. has delivered and is delivering other types of armored vehicles. The Abrams tanks, I think 31 have been promised. The promise was made in January. It appears now that delivery may not take place until, of those particular tanks, until perhaps August or later. Yesterday, some U.S. senators, both Republican and Democrat, complained about this and asked the Pentagon to speed this up. What are some of the particular things that our audience should know about Abrams tanks?
Well, the Abrams tank is perhaps the most sophisticated tank on the battlefield on the globe today. And when it does, in fact, arrive on the battlefield, I think it will have a significant effect. And in comparison, I also was reading that the Russians are actually moving some T-54 and T-55 tanks to the Ukraine out of existing stocks that they have. Now, to give you a comparison, the T-54 and the T-55 are about 75 years old. And should a T-54 be engaged by an Abrams, that'll be the most unfair fight you can possibly imagine. But the M1, of course, the decision to deploy the M1, the United States resisted that because the M1 is a very sophisticated weapon system and demands an awful lot of maintenance. It is also, and this is my words, a complete fuel hog. It doesn't go by miles per gallon, it goes by gallons per mile. And that's one of the reasons, because we were an M1 heavy force in the Gulf, that when we got to Kuwait, as I described a while ago, we were out of fuel because the M1s were sucking so much fuel as we were going across the desert. And that'll be a logistical problem that the Ukrainians will have to address. Clearly, the decision to deploy, and I think it's 31 Abrams to Ukraine, was a political decision to give, in particular, my interpretation, German Chancellor Scholz political top cover to allow him then to move forward in providing Leo 2s from Germany and authorization from other countries who had purchased Leo 2s to provide them as well. And so I think it's a political as well as a military effort. But as far as the Abrams goes, for all the sophistication of the weapon system, and it could have a devastating effect, the density is still pretty small. 31 is not an enormous amount. 31 is about a battalion, maybe a battalion plus, a single battalion plus. But in terms of logistics, this is then a low density what we would call a low density system that has a very long logistical tail in terms of unique spare parts. The oil filter that fits on a Leo 2, it's probably not going to fit on an Abrams or the engine or spare parts for the turret. Even the fuel, by the way, for the Abrams is different. It uses basically JP4, basically jet fuel, as opposed to diesel, which most of the other vehicles use. During the Gulf War, one thing we did, which was really pushed by the Abrams, because I was in support of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. We were the lead attack force, if anybody remembers that far back, for the big 7th Corps Hook. And so we had a lot of ground to cover. And we were a heavy M1 force. So we had American contractors forward with us at the very tip of the offensive. And they were there primarily to perform immediate battlefield maintenance on the Abrams. Not so much mechanical, as I recall, it was more for turret and fire control issues. So they were right there at the front. And as I recall, several of them actually ended up being casualties. So using the Abrams as an example, I think one of the big decisions that needs to be made is expanding our ability, frankly, to put foreign military contractors forward into Ukraine, not up on the battlefield necessarily, but at least in Western Ukraine. So as these platforms, be it an M1 again, or be it an M109 Howitzer, or be it a NASM, or be it a Patriot missile, or be it a HIMARS, or be it a Bradley, pick your platform, as these require maintenance or require repair after battle damage, they can be moved only a short distance, repaired, and doing the maintenance as far forward as possible to get the equipment back into the fight as quickly as possible is crucial to maintaining the tempo, particularly in an offensive military operation. Let me add one additional historical example. I think it's one thing people don't realize, that I would argue the collapse of the Afghan military at the end of the Afghan war was not necessarily totally because the last 2,500 American soldiers left Afghanistan. The departure of the last 3,000 to 4,000 foreign contractors from Afghanistan, I think, was what really was the death knell for the Afghan military, because those contractors were the ones that were keeping the Afghan Air Force, to include rotary wing as well as fixed wing aircraft, aloft. And when they left, the Air Force was done. And the Afghans' then ability to resupply forward operating bases scattered all over the country went to zero. And as a consequence, the whole system collapsed. So I think really some consideration as we do begin an offensive, and we begin that offensive with all this new sophisticated military equipment, thinking about that issue of foreign contractors is one that needs to be thought hard of. I did read just the other day that apparently Poland and Germany have decided to do some degree of forward logistical presence in Western Ukraine, in particularly to support the Leo, which may be sort of putting our toe in the water here in terms of making that particular decision. Now, I don't want to say that decision is taken lightly. I mean, it has enormous implications for further commitment by NATO and the United States in the war, accusations by the Russians that we're an active participant, this is a proxy war, escalation. And so all those particular questions are out there, but it just seems to me that is really the most essential question in many ways, logistically, that needs to be taken.
So really interesting point, and for Europeans to watch as well as here in Washington. Final question from me, and this is to look ahead a little bit. I was struck over the past month or so that the Biden administration approach has not been without its critics. On the one hand, there are some, for example, even on the Republican side, who are complaining that the administration is doing too little, it's too incremental. I've heard those criticisms also among some people out of government now, but who are very well connected to the administration and very sympathetic to what the administration has done so far. There's a small group of vocal Republicans, mainly vocal Republicans, who think that Ukraine is really not that important for U.S. security. For the time being, they seem to be in the minority. Maybe you could say a word about that, but I think even more interesting is what we've heard from two former U.S. European commanders who were also SACEUR, NATO SACEUR. That was General Philip Breedlove and Admiral Jim Stavridis. And they've both given interviews in the past month and a half, where while understanding the administration's approach, they've argued that now is the time to drop the incremental approach and to provide a lot more and as fast as possible. Stavridis was perhaps the more specific of the two. He specifically advocated three things: longer range surface-to-surface missiles. These would be the ATACMS, which are follow-on to the HIMARS. Could be very effective, I'm told, in destroying Russian logistical nodes. Fighter aircraft, and Stavridis specifically proposes that the U.S. provide F-16 combat aircraft. He estimated the training required for Ukrainian pilots to be about 6 to 8 weeks. This would be a major new commitment. And his third on his wish list is longer range cruise missiles that can go after Russia's Black Fleet. Both of them acknowledge that there are concerns about escalation, but they feel that these concerns have been overplayed over the past year. They tend to discount, it seems to me, they discount the risk of Russian use of, for example, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. As a former artillery officer in Europe during the Cold War, you might have a word to say about the practicality or the impracticality of the use of by Russia of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So that's just a kind of a potpourri, but as a last question. And so talk to our audience a little bit about how you see the future.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, Leo. I'll try to be quick. You're exactly right. In the United States Congress, particularly in the Republican Party, there's this real split. I mean, you talked about how senators were criticizing the pace at which we were delivering, for example, the M1 in testimony just yesterday. And that was a curious combination of, on the one hand, Senator Tom Cotton, a very conservative Republican from the great state of Arkansas, and Angus King, a pretty liberal Democrat or independent from the state of Maine. And both of them were making the same complaint about why are we taking so long to deliver these 31 Abrams to Ukraine. And that has been, on the broader scale, it has really, I think, shown a dramatic divide in the Republican Party as we move very soon towards a primary season and a national election in 2024 between what I would call sort of the Mitch McConnell, more traditional Republican Party, which has been very strident on foreign policy, very supportive of national security policy, et cetera, and the Donald Trump, DeSantis wing, them being, as most people believe, the primary aspirants to be the Republican nominee in 2024, who argue that this is not our war, that we should get out of this. I find it, first of all, politically, I don't see how this can last much longer, how they can go into an election so deeply divided on perhaps the most fundamental issue of American foreign policy in a presidential election campaign without literally shattering the party. But we'll see how they try to solve that problem or paper over it. For those who say it's not our war, my response has always been, look, from a realpolitik standpoint, just from if you allow Russia to be successful in this particular conflict, then what you've basically done is encourage Xi Jinping to move more quickly against Taiwan. If the world community cannot stand up to this grossly overt aggression, war crimes by an autocratic state against a democracy, then you're basically giving a green light to Xi Jinping to move more quickly. And number two is, though the alliance has come together remarkably, and now even more remarkably, once again, with our addition of our Finnish friends, I think most people on this call could speak better to this than I, but I think this would have a shattering effect on the alliance. And I think many Europeans that I talk with will say to me, well, who is the aberration in American foreign policy? Was Donald Trump the aberration, who was clearly an isolationist, who talked about pulling us out of NATO, who talked about pulling our troops out of Korea, and most of his senior national security advisors, subsequently to his loss in the last election, have said if he had gotten reelected, he would have pulled us out of NATO. So is he the aberration, or is Joe Biden the aberration, who arrives as president and says America's back, and really has done, I think, a pretty remarkable job in maintaining alliance unity. And you and I, NATO, in our time in the Pentagon and the White House, know that that's not necessarily always a given. So looking to the future, which of those is the aberration is a question I find on many Europeans' mind. I just returned from Europe in the last few days. So from a realpolitik standpoint, it seems to me very clear that supporting Ukraine is key to the United States. Secondly, from a moral standpoint, how can one idly stand by and watch 10,000 women and children get murdered just like they were murdered last night, and as you described so well, an indiscriminate missile attack on a residential area, and do nothing about it and say, as the world superpower, it's not any of your business? Morally, it seems to me that is totally vacant of any possible moralism. And then last but not least, democracy. The whole idea of the values we say we stand for, the international norms we say we stand for, the international norms that we work so hard, and frankly, people in past and in conflicts died to create, and all those norms go. So if those three reasons, from the standpoint of realpolitik, morality, and democracy, I can't quite understand these particular people's argument that Ukraine's not our fight. Curiously enough, again, they seem to cast that particular argument in what I call China, 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 and China. And I fear too oftentimes now I hear congressmen who are trying to be more difficult on China or harder on China than the congressmen they're running against or sitting next to them. Who can be most difficult to China at this particular moment? I'm not making a case for the Chinese, who have done some pretty terrible things here, but at the same time, this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy if you're not careful. And so trying to describe this as a trade-off, I think is totally misplaced. And last but not least, these were the same people that for 20 odd years were voting overseas contingency budgets for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I think at one point reached over $160 billion annually. To move on to Breedlove and Jim Stavridis' comments, and Jim's an old friend and a guy I greatly admire. I kind of disagree with them and I kind of agree with them. Like I said, if I was to make an argument right now, what my main priority would be for the Ukrainians, besides the wherewithal they need for the imminent offensive, which is ammunition and air defense, I would probably argue for foreign military contractors to keep the equipment going and keep it moving. ATACMS, because would be a useful weapon system for them right now, because when you provide any country a new weapon system, I'm coming back to providing them a capability and not just a weapon. It's a question of how rapidly they can absorb it in what they're doing. And an ATACMS is basically a rocket in a box. And you slap it on the same HIMARS platform or MLRS platform that they're using right now, and you make some adjustments in terms of the orientation of the weapon, and you launch it, okay? So the absorption rate for that particular weapon system is pretty doggone fast. And I would argue as well, as Jim does, that this would put at risk, particularly Russian supply lines and them trying to move equipment forward to blunt this offensive. The F-16, though I think you're right, and Air Force people I've talked with have said an experienced pilot can get that in about 6 or 8 weeks, particularly if you focus his or her efforts on either they're going to fly the F-16 in a close support role, or they're going to fly the F-16 in a what we call a CAP, or combat air patrol role, counter air role. And this is often done, particularly the Russians did this with their Air Force, focusing pilots into particular roles, where we try to train pilots in so-called multi-role missions. Could be done pretty quickly, but still the absorption rate for the F-16 would take a significant period of time in terms of all the logistical support to maintain the aircraft, fuel the aircraft, the type of bombing systems that can be hung from those particular aircraft would take a longer period of time. In the last few weeks, some of our NATO partners have provided MiG-29s, but obviously those can be absorbed very quickly because the Ukrainians already have supply chains that support MiG-29s. As far as the escalation of nuclear weapons go, I still say we need to be clear-eyed by the fact that I still believe we are in the greatest potentially nuclear confrontation we have been in since October of 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. While I don't want to make everybody upset on the call, I'm not predicting that, but the probability of a nuclear confrontation, West versus Russia, is certainly not zero by any means. If the Russians were going to use nuclear weapons, they argue in their doctrine, which I've studied extensively, to use nuclear weapons for two reasons. Reason number one, when the very existence of the nation is put at risk, and they talk about using tactical systems, and they've got well over a couple thousand of those, to what they call escalate to de-escalate. Very similar to what we talked about in many ways back during our NATO days in the Cold War, that we would use tactical nuclear weapons to make sure that our adversary realized that there was potential to rapid escalation, and that would bring the war to a conclusion. So that's one reason the Russians say they would use nuclear weapons to escalate to de-escalate, because they think that the existence of the state is at risk. The second way they've talked about it operationally is to use tactical nuclear weapons to speed the offensive. Russian military doctrine for ground operations emphasizes two things: speed and mass. Speed and mass. The idea is to move across in the offensive using tanks and armored personnel carriers as rapidly as you can and just roll up your adversary. And if the attack slows, you try to accelerate, get back on track by using either heavy concentrated artillery, if they shard, or if need be, tactical nuclear weapon, blow a hole in the defense, and then continue your armored advance. And Russian military equipment, mechanized equipment, was designed to provide some protection to the crew to move through those particular areas. Problem now is they don't have the offensive mechanized force to exploit any type of opportunity the employment of a tactical nuclear weapon might provide. So the only reason they would do it is because of that second reason, existential. And that brings me to my final disagreement with Jim, I guess, is I am concerned that more and more, this is not a threat to the existence of Russia as it is it's an existential threat for Vladimir Putin. Mr. Putin, who now has been identified as a war criminal, and I wonder how we can negotiate with somebody who's been a war criminal. And so therefore, I'm concerned as this becomes more and more a matter of his personal existential threat, that if cornered, he might resort to escalation in an effort to bring this to a close. And the one thing that seems to me, at least from what I can tell, most opaque, while we seem to have penetrated their intelligence based on this leak that came out in the last few days, the one thing that's most opaque is how decisions are taken in the Kremlin. And we do know, though, the circle of people advising Mr. Putin, well, let's put it this way. There are a lot more people on this call right now than have immediate access to Putin to provide him advice right now.
Thanks, Jeff. A lot there to digest. I'm going to turn it back to Charlie, and you can collect and pose some of the questions to our audience. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff and Leo. That was brilliant and a great start. Yeah, there are a few questions here. I have a few questions. I'm going to start with ones from Ukkonen. Do you believe European, US, and other international partners are doing enough to assist Ukraine to scale up its own domestic munitions manufacturing capabilities?
Well, the short answer is I don't know that much about the Ukrainian industrial base. I know the Ukrainians have been enormously innovative. I often refer to the Ukrainian army as MacGyver's army. That's probably wasted on a European audience, but there's a TV program here in the United States about a guy who can kind of put together anything and make it work. And the Ukrainians have been incredibly innovative in how they've done that. I've seen, for example, where they have taken a couple $100 drone, used a 3D printer to create a triggering device, hung grenades on the drone, and used those to drop on the Russians as a pretty simple but very effective weapon system. So short answer is I'm not sure I know that much about what we've done. I know the real key thing probably that the Europeans, I'm told, have done is really maintaining the energy infrastructure of the Ukraine. As the Russians have been targeting the energy infrastructure, the electric power grid of the Ukraine, the Europeans, I think, have done a pretty doggone good job based on capacity in providing them immediate assistance to get damaged energy systems back online, and altering the grid to share energy to keep Ukraine up and running. And this has an enormous impact, not only in terms of the ongoing conflict, but one thing I still worry about is, we've got 15 nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and we got one at Zaporizhia, which is contested, as we all well know. And the safety and reliability of those particular power plants relies on an awful lot of external electricity. So the possibility of them losing that electricity would be dire. And finally, I think I tell my American friends who often say, "Are we doing enough?" I'm saying, no, we're not doing enough. And the only measure of doing enough is when the war's over and Ukraine's been successful. But I think one thing we Americans, I'm not being gratuitous, I just think it's a fact, don't recognize is the enormous effort our European colleagues have done in terms of economic support to Ukraine, to making sure the Ukrainian economy doesn't collapse along the way, number one. And number two, the humanitarian effort in terms of which we are not affected by. And I was speaking to a group the other day of Americans from a large city of about 600,000 people, and I said to them, try to imagine you're the mayor of Warsaw. Mayor of Warsaw has about 1.3, 1.4 million people. In late February and early March of 2022, 250,000 people showed up to move in with you. And the vast majority of them were what? Women, children, and elderly who needed housing, food, medical supplies, etc. And the Europeans, particularly the frontline states in Europe, have taken that on in a remarkable fashion. I'm sure that's happened in Finland. And this is something, so I said this, got these folks in this town of about 650,000. How would you feel if 125,000 people proportionally showed up over a period of 2 weeks and needed that kind of assistance here? So we need to understand, as we talk about who's bearing the burdens, that there are multiple burdens out there to be borne.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point, and I have similar experiences of trying to explain kind of what all is needed. As you might know, Finland, of course, has a kind of a what Cold War would have been total defense perspective. So resilience and all of these count towards actually delivering military capabilities on the battlefield. Another question, which it's going to be hard to answer other than maybe anecdotally, but do you believe sanctions have shown any measure of success in hobbling Russian artillery or other munitions manufacturing capabilities? If not, what further steps should or could be taken?
Yeah, the sanctions have not worked as well as we had hoped, but I think they have certainly worked to a large degree, and we can just measure that by economic output. And the economists that I looked at suggest that the Russian economy has grown at about 0.5% for 2022, and expectations are even worse for 2023. Ultimately, though, to move beyond the sanctions, but perhaps not, what Vladimir Putin has done strategically is, I think, been disastrous for Russia long term. Russia has lost this war already, because if the war ended today, Russia is an extraction economy. Russia has always been an extraction economy. I don't know anybody here in the United States that drives a Russian car, has a Russian computer, or a Russian cell phone. And if anybody does, please contact me, okay? So consequently, if you're an extraction economy, the worst thing you can do is make your customers believe that you're an unreliable extraction economy. So again, I'll refer to more people in this call. Western Europe, which had followed a policy of economic interdependence, which really was the philosophical basis for the European Union. After multiple wars in the 19th century, if we become economically interdependent, that will reduce the possibility of future violence. That, to me, is the essence of the idea, which worked remarkably well. The extension of that idea, I think, towards the Russian Federation was the idea that captivated many European leaders in the aftermath of the Cold War. If we can create this complex interdependence, therefore the possibility of conflict will in fact be reduced. And that was particularly in oil and natural gas. So who's more dependent? The supplier who needs to sell it to you, or the buyer who needs the commodity? Well, now that's not going to happen anymore. It's just not. And furthermore, longer term, I would say it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to see significant foreign investment going into Russia, even if the war ended today, and a need for the recapitalization, particularly of a lot of the energy resources that Russia uses for extraction. So that economy is therefore in a bad way long term. Now, you can sell more oil and natural gas to the Chinese, and they're certainly doing that at discounted prices, but that puts you in a more vassal state, as the Chinese like to say, position, number one, And the Chinese are wise enough strategically that they're going to diversify their extraction, and you're going to see them, as they are right now, purchasing oil and natural gas from Iran and purchasing it from the UAE and purchasing it from Saudi Arabia. They're not going to become dependent totally on oil and natural gas. And then finally, though short term, perhaps not longer term, I think what Mr. Putin has done for the whole world is accelerate our shift away from fossil fuels, ultimately to the detriment of the Russian Federation. So if you're Vladimir Putin and you do that, and you've got an aging population, you got a declining population that will drop to about 125 million by the middle of this century. And oh, by the way, 1 million young Russians who were very talented, more often than not, educated young people, decided when you announced a mobilization, they were leaving, and they're not going to come back because they've got a great job in Finland, or they got a great job in Austria, and they've got a girlfriend there to boot. So they're not going back to Russia when this is all over with. So those are the longer term effects that I think the sanctions will over time occur. Short term, not as significant as we have hoped, though we do see the departure of an awful lot of foreign companies in the last few days. I think one of them was Finnish, if I'm not mistaken. The Russians took over, was a Finnish and a German company, I think, or tried to, is going to nationalize them as sort of reparations. Well, that's certainly not going to encourage foreign investment. And it's probably going to encourage any residual foreign companies that are in Russia to depart, making your situation even worse. Specifically back to artillery, it's very clear that they haven't been able to keep up the pace. At 40,000 rounds, they haven't been able to keep up the pace. So they're trying desperately to buy artillery rounds from North Korea. Without getting too geeky, I can tell you as an artilleryman, if I was firing a North Korean artillery round, I'd probably stand back with a lanyard about 100 yards long before when I fired it, okay? Because the reliability of this stuff, I think, would be pretty questionable, to say the least. And that's a difficult problem when you're firing lethal weapons. We also know that they've been trying to buy stuff from other places. We know that they were trying to buy artillery from Egypt. We know that they've bought a lot of drones from Iran. We know that there's talk of them buying missiles from Iran. And all those bespeak the fact that their capacity, at least right now, to generate munitions at the rate they need is lacking. Now, final word on that. They have, I think, been moving more and more to put the Russian economy overall on a war footing. So over time, can they generate that capacity is the great unknown.
All right, great. Thank you. I see we have a few minutes. I'm going to try to combine a few questions, and if you just take a stab at them. One has to do with manpower, where Ukraine and Russia have suffered, well, a lot of losses in trained personnel. So even if the weapons deliveries can be maintained, what's your sense on Ukraine's ability to reconstitute or continue to field skilled forces? I'll add to it another one. You mentioned, or you talked about logistics and servicing requirements. Could you give some thoughts on whether or not there's a difference between normal and wartime requirements? So if you want to push an attack, as Ukraine may want to, can you just ignore some lights on the dashboard and be like, you know what, we'll deal with that eventually? So some thoughts on that. And then a final question here, just on U.S. Political support. You touched on it, but if you can take a stab on, is there a hard limit, or does it depend how things go in the next couple of months in Ukraine?
Okay, a lot there. I'll try to be quick. You're right. Both sides have suffered grievously. Estimates are the Russians have suffered over 200,000 casualties in the war in Ukraine. Of that, probably 40 to 50,000 dead, the rest wounded, captured, missing, deserted, whatever. That's an enormous manpower drain. In terms of material estimates, Russians have lost over half of their tanks. As I mentioned before, there are reports of them moving T-54s and T-55s forward to the battlefield. But obviously, Ukraine has not been immune to that as well. Again, estimates, we don't know. Probably 100,000 casualties, probably 20, 25,000 dead have been the Ukrainian problem. I've talked to folks in Ukraine, and curiously enough, one of their challenges has been changing rules around conscription. They put limits on males being able to depart the country, okay? But they had an enormous number of what we call exemptions to military service. If you were a parent, if you had aging parents you were caring for, if you were a school teacher, if you were a nurse, if you were and other critical sectors of the economy, because that's peacetime. So we have all kinds of exemptions to allow you to continue doing what you're doing as opposed to going into the military. Well, politically, for a democracy, and you know, as several people on the call are probably participating in the Finnish parliament and the conscription you have in your country, to change those rules and suddenly reduce all those exemptions overnight, that's a very difficult societal problem. And that's one they're wrestling with right now. But even at 100,000, Ukraine being a smaller country than Russia, I mean, almost every family that you talk to has suffered in some regard. A colleague of mine, his wife lost a nephew. His nephew is serving in Bakhmut. But beyond that, I mean, also the impact on the Ukrainians has been the refugee problem. As we talked about before, don't forget there are about 12 million plus or minus Ukrainian refugees or displaced people. About 5 million of them are in Europe, and about 7 million are in the Ukraine. So my colleague, his wife lost the nephew, and he has a nephew fighting in Bakhmut, they've also got all their relatives from the Donbass now living with them in Kyiv. So that's been a second part. But for the Ukrainians, I think one thing, you know, during the Vietnam War, a colonel once said, if you don't know what to count, you make what you can count important. Now think about that for a second. If you don't know what to count, you make what you can count important. So to be crude, we use body counts and by all measure, we were winning. You could just look at the numbers and we were winning. Well, we know how that turned out. And I like to point out to people, so far about every assumption about the war in Ukraine has been wrong. The Russians won't attack, Ukrainians won't fight, NATO won't get its act together, the US will be all messed up, et cetera. Every assumption has been false, okay? So we need to be careful about what we can count. And that comes back to a comment, thinking of manpower and reconstitution, that Napoleon Bonaparte once made. And Napoleon Bonaparte once said, the moral is the physical is 3:1. The moral is the physical is 3:1. So as we look at this offensive, it seems to me, at least in the general category, when I talk to them, Ukrainians understand fully what they're fighting for. They understand it very clearly and very personally. Their country has been attacked. Their cities are being struck. They've lost relatives. They understand that. If you're a Russian soldier right now sitting in a trench and you got 3 weeks of training and maybe handed a flak jacket and a real old AK-47 and stuck out there with very little food and no medical support, you're not quite sure what you're fighting for. So when the offensive begins, that I think is one thing we can't count, but becomes critically important. And then in terms of normal versus wartime, every leader in every operation, and the military is the most classic because the stakes are so high, but even the corporate world, every leader has to calculate, and I do that in the work I do for corporate groups, risk. How much risk are you willing to take? The British Special Air Service, the SAS, their motto is, he who dares wins. He who dares wins. And if you can get an offensive going, yes, it may take more materiel initially, but if you get it going and it's moving, that's why speed is so important. Actually, your consumption rates go down. Our estimates for consumption rates of artillery in the Gulf War were huge. We actually only used a fraction of that because we rolled them up. Our real consumption problem and movement problem was fuel, because one last anecdote, there was one phase line that we were supposed to hit in 3 days. And I remember my commander before the attack saying, if we get to this phase line in 3 days, we're all going to be heroes. We were there in 6 hours. Okay. So you just don't know what you don't know about this, and the moral is the physical is 3:1. As far as hard limits, U.S. support for the war, if you trust public opinion polls, about 60%. I think this upcoming election may well be a hard limit, obviously, if Mr. Biden was to lose. But sort of inside baseball, how we resolve our current budgetary issues about the debt has enormous impact. The administration, just based on what they have expended so far, probably will need to go back for another appropriation for Ukrainian support, either later this summer or early this fall. I think the current appropriation is about $40 billion. As Leo pointed out on the fact sheet, we spent about $35 billion. But But Mr. Biden is not going to go back for that appropriation until he gets through this debt challenge that we have within the country right now. And if that should go south, then it could have very deleterious effects, not only politically here in the United States, but frankly on the economy in the United States. And that will certainly distract American people if they start seeing a very serious economic situation, higher inflation rates, higher unemployment, and all those things.
Right, great. Thank you for some excellent answers, insights, as well as then providing anecdotes and stories which really give to especially the non-expert audience insight into, of course, your expertise, but also something to touch and sense, as it were. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Leo, for what has been to me, super enlightening webinar on Ukraine. I only hope that we don't have to hold one of these a year from now. But on the other hand, if we do, I hope that the gods have been with Ukraine on that case. And of course, the long-term economic, humanitarian, and global security implications are yet covered in a little bit of a fog on this. But thank you to the audience. Thank you for the questions. And I look forward to seeing some of you at the next Transatlantic Currents event. This webinar is closed. Thank you.